Hi everyone. Welcome back to the Facts of Life lecture series. We're now on the second lecture of the second module. And what I'm going to do in the next two lectures is talk to you about a timeline of ideas in population ecology. So I've got the entire timeline here on the title slide, and we're just going to go through Lotka and Volterra's predator-prey cycles today, well, in this lecture. And then in the next lecture, we'll go into some of the later, more contemporary improvements in the ideas of population ecology. So starting in the year 1202, Leonardo Fibonacci thought about rabbits. And what he said was, a certain man put a pair of rabbits in a place surrounded on all sides by a wall. How many pairs of rabbits can be produced from that pair in a year, if it is supposed that every month each pair begets a new pair, which from the second month on becomes productive? Thinking about rabbits, this is what he came up with. And again, it's only from the second month on that it becomes productive, but then after that, we're getting more and more rabbits as each pair reproduces. And what he came up with is this sequence of numbers, which may be familiar to you, especially if you see his name. This is the Fibonacci sequence. And as he looked beyond rabbits, he saw this pattern across the natural world. Things as disparate as the petals of flowers, the shells of mollusks, the pine cone, seed-bearing cones of conifers. And so this is a population ecology problem, query that ended up helping him understand multiple patterns in the natural world. Next, we have to look a little bit far into the future before we see people really thinking cohesively about populations again. And Thomas Malthus thought about human populations. He said, the power of population, meaning human population, is so superior to the power for the earth to provide subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or the other visit the human race. Remember that, some shape or other. So this is the math that got him there. Basically, human population grows exponentially. But the availability of resources increase linearly. And that is true even when you consider agricultural advances. So, unless we have some sort of check on human population growth, whether we have catastrophic checks on the level of survival, things like hunger, disease, and war, or preventative checks that are more on the reproductive capacity of humans, things like abortion, birth control, bone marriage, because 1800s, 1700s, don't have any kids until you get married, right? Or celibacy. So then, a few decades later, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace together came up with natural selection. And when I say they did it together, that might be a bit of a misnomer. They figured this out at the same time. And if you think about what I told you last week about science as a process and we're building on each other's work, it may make sense that two people could come up with this really important theory of natural selection around the same time. Darwin was the first to come up with it, but he didn't publish it until Alfred Russel Wallace sent him his manuscript. So these guys are contemporaries, but it is right that Darwin gets credit for most of it. In any case, here's what Darwin said about natural selection. He said, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as, consequently, there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. So think about that in the context of the beetles that I told you about in the last lecture. So the benefit that one phenotype had, that one genotype had, that led to the phenotype was increased reproductive capacity. Okay, so what did Wallace say? This one's a little longer, but I'm still going to read it to you because it gives you insight into his thought process and how science works. So he says, at the time in question, I was suffering from a sharp attack of intermittent fever, and every day during the cold and succeeding hot fits had to lie down for several hours, during which time I had nothing to do but to think over any subjects then particularly interesting to me. One day something brought to my recollection Malthus's Principles of Population, and that's what I just told you about, which I had read about 12 years before. And as animals usually breed much more rapidly than does mankind, the destruction every year from these causes must be enormous in order to keep down the numbers of each species, since they evidently do not increase regularly from year to year, as otherwise the world would long ago have been densely crowded with those that breed most quickly. Vaguely thinking over the enormous and constant destruction which this implied, it occurred to me to ask the question, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly that on the whole, the best fitted live. From the effects of disease, the most healthy escaped. From enemies, the strongest, the swiftest, or the most cunning. From famine, the best hunters or those with the best digestion, and so on. Then it suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation the inferior would inevitably be killed off, and the superior would remain. That is, the fittest would survive. Now, keep in mind when he says race, he's not talking about humans. This is all about animals. Okay, so then a few decades later, Alfred Lotka, who was a mathematician and physicist, started thinking about how populations grow and how different ages are responsible for reproduction. So we can break down a population into the different ages and think about a few things. The fecundity rate, so reproductive capacity, mortality rate, so how much they die at that age, and the survival rate, how likely they are to make it to the next stage, next oldest stage. And with that, he was able to model the growth of populations. Next, Lotka teamed up with an Italian mathematician named Vito Volterra. And Volterra made the observation that in Italy, just before World War I started, there were a little over 10% of all the fishes caught by fishermen were predators. And then there was a period of time when the Italians were not catching fish. Those populations were able to rebound, and what they found was that a much greater proportion, about 40% of the catch, was then predators. But when the Italians came back to their fishing boats, what they found was a steady decline in that percentage until it came back to about the level it was before. And that led them to think about how predators depend on prey populations, and that there's an oscillating relationship where the two cycles are they're slightly offset by each other, and predator populations depend on prey populations. Okay, so that's all I have for this lecture. If you have any questions, please use the discussions tab of Canvas to ask them. I will check it periodically as always. If you think you can help your fellow students, please do. And I will be available in my WebEx room during my office hours, and you can see the URL right there. And have a good day.